Although 150 examples of Parnall's Panther were built after the signing of the armistice in November 1918, further orders for military aircraft were severely restricted in the early 1920s. The Royal Navy's sole full-deck carrier, the Argus, thus deployed with a motley collection of Panthers for recon, Newport Nightjar fighters, and the odd Sopwith Cuckoo and Westland Walrus. This was not as bad as it perhaps seems, as Argus's primary mission in this period was to spot for the battle line, and the two-seat Panther was good for this role. But eventually, in 1922, the Admiralty released a specification for a high-performance single-seat fighter able to use either the Bristol Jupiter or Armstrong Siddeley Jaguar radial engines interchangeably. With significant experience in carrier aircraft design under its belt, Parnall was one of the two successful respondents to the specification. Whereas the Panther had contained several novel features, Parnall's Plover was far more conventional. A plover, incidentally, is a kind of wading bird, somewhat less threatening than a panther. The Plover was a single-bay biplane with staggered wings of equal length. There were full-spanned ailerons on both the top and bottom wings. The fin and rudder were well-rounded, and the tailplane was braced to the lower sides of the rear fuselage with wires. That fuselage was fabric stretched over a wooden frame. For use as a land or carrier aircraft, the landing gear was a simple cross-axle type with pneumatic suspension for rough field operations, which were most operations in 1922. Clips were fitted to engage the wires that ran fore to aft on Royal Navy carriers to stabilize the aircraft on takeoff and slow it down on landing. The landing gear was also easily removable, and it could be replaced by a set of floats in order to transform the Plover into an amphibian. The floats had small wheels beneath them so that the aircraft could be dragged onto land and pushed off it. The tail skid was retained in amphibious mode, and the floats incorporated water rudders for steering. All up, it was 23 feet long with a wingspan of 29 feet. It weighed 2,035 pounds empty and just under 3,000 at full load. Range was 300 miles, and armament came from a pair of 303 Vickers machine guns synchronized to fire through the propeller. Accuracy as a gun platform was considered pretty good. It could also carry 4 20-pound bombs under the wings. The first prototype Plover emerged in the first months of 1923. It was powered by a 436 horsepower Jupiter 4. Navy assessment of it was that the rival Fairey Flycatcher was an obviously superior machine in almost all aspects. The Navy did not yet, however, commit to the Flycatcher alone. For starters, the alternative Jaguar engine had yet to be tried, and there seemed no hurry to decide on a single manufacturer. There were also many tests to complete. Amongst other things, the specification included floatplane versions and the ability to take off from a platform on a battleship gun turret, which required the right ships to be available for the tests. Parnall went back to the drawing board in the interim. They reduced the depth of the fuselage for better aerodynamics, which also had the effect of improving forward visibility for the pilot on takeoff and landing. That change also moved the pilot further away from the upper wing, making entry and exit easier. Those wings were slightly further staggered. In combination, angle of attack on approach was reduced and landing speeds fell. In this configuration, the third prototype demonstrated much improved handling characteristics. Furthermore, being built around the Jupiter 4 gave it an advantage over the Flycatcher, which was based on the less powerful 325 horsepower Jaguar. Modifying the Flycatcher for the Jupiter proved impossible as the weight distribution was all wrong and it couldn't be successfully ballasted. The Admiralty were therefore strongly considering dropping the Flycatcher in favor of the faster, easier-handling Plover when disaster struck. Concerns had already been raised during testing about the amount of flexing that occurred in the Plover's fuselage during maneuvers. Then, on a test flight in July 1924, a Navy pilot was performing a series of acrobatic maneuvers when the center section abruptly collapsed. Miraculously, he was able to control the half-destroyed aircraft and landed it on a stretch of moorland near the River Eden. Despite a lobby to take some Plovers on the basis of their greater performance, which made it more able to take off from a turret platform, the Chief of the Air Staff ultimately decided that the Plover wouldn't withstand the strain put on it and it couldn't be trusted. This decision was made easier as Armstrong Siddeley progressively increased the Jaguar's performance, first to 360 horsepower and then to 385. This closed the performance margin, although the Plover remained faster than the Flycatcher, being able to hit 142 miles an hour against 133. Its service ceiling was also 3,000 feet higher at 22,000 feet, and it looked sleeker and more aerodynamic, for all that matters. Abandonment of the turret launch requirement signed the Plover's death knell. Only 10 Plovers were ordered, and only 7 of these were the carrier versions. With Flycatchers entering service in numbers, the half-dozen Plovers were out of service by the end of 1924. Only one example went into civilian service. It was written off in a crash in 1929. And with it ended Parnall's brief but important role as the dominant supplier of British carrier aircraft.